I have spent 45 years as a structural engineer, designing foundations built to withstand the heaviest pressures, yet nothing prepared me for the sheer weight of my own son's lie. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles into a father's bones when he realizes his only child has turned him into a convenient afterthought. I stood in my kitchen, looking down at the 2 prime ribeye steaks resting on the wooden cutting board, seasoned exactly the way Julian used to love them. I had spent the afternoon preparing this meal, choosing to bypass the luxury of my private chefs. I wanted tonight, Father's Day, to be simple. I wanted to sit across from my son and just talk. The kitchen was warm, filled with the rich aroma of seared rosemary and garlic, a stark contrast to the cold void expanding in my chest. My hands, calloused from decades of hard labor before I built my industrial empire, were steady as I basted the meat. But my heart was uneasy. Julian had been distant lately, wrapped up in the high society aspirations of his new wife and her pretentious family. I had hoped tonight would be a return to our roots. Then, my phone vibrated on the counter. The screen lit up with his name, shattering the quiet warmth of the room. When I answered, Julian's voice came through, fast and breathy, painted with a thin veneer of panic. He told me there was a critical merger emergency at the firm. He claimed a server had crashed, threatening a major acquisition, and that he had to stay at the office all night. He sounded convincing, but I spent a lifetime reading Structural Integrity, and I could hear the microfractures in his voice. More than that, I heard the background. Through the receiver, my sharp ears caught the unmistakable, high-pitched ring of fine lead crystal glasses clinking together in a toast. I heard the low, melodic murmur of a harp playing and the distinct nasal laughter of his mother-in-law, Beatrice. Julian wasn't in a cold server room. He was sitting in a high-end restaurant, surrounded by the very social climbers he had married into. He was feast dining with his in-laws, celebrating Father's Day with a man who had never sacrificed a single day of sweat for him, while the home-cooked meal I made for him grew cold on my stove. I swallowed my pride, keeping my voice perfectly calm, matching the quiet authority I had used to lead thousands of men in my factories. I told him I understood, that work always comes first, and wished him luck. He thanked me quickly, sounding relieved by how easily his old father had bought the deception, and hung up. I stood there in the silence of my home, staring at the phone. The betrayal did not make me angry. It made me cold. I looked at the beautifully set table, the empty chair opposite me, and the food that would now go to waste. Julian had not just cancelled a dinner, he had severed a pillar of trust. He believed his father was just a simple, retired old man who could be easily managed with a clever lie. He had no idea that the very restaurant he was sitting in was part of my undisclosed real estate portfolio, or that his betrayal had just set in motion a complete collapse of his gilded world. There is a profound difference between suspecting a lie and looking it directly in the eyes. I did not turn off my kitchen stove out of anger. I did it with the precise, methodical movement of an engineer who has spent his life calculating tolerances. The drive to the Obsidian was silent, the hum of my modest sedan a stark contrast to the storm of cold clarity settling in my mind. I purchased that restaurant 10 years ago through a shell corporation, a quiet investment in a world I chose never to inhabit. Tonight, its glittering obsidian facade did not feel like an asset. It felt like a stage set for my own execution. I entered through the discreet back hallway, a passage reserved for the owner. The staff did not question my presence. The general manager gave me a subtle, respectful nod, knowing better than to announce my arrival. I slipped into the shadowed velvet-draped booth at the far corner of the mezzanine. From this elevated vantage point, I could look down upon the grand dining hall, a sea of white tablecloths, glittering crystal, and wealthy patrons bathing in their own self-importance. It did not take me long to find them. They were seated at table 7, the most prominent spot in the room, bathed in the warm glow of a crystal chandelier. There sat my son Julian, looking perfectly tailored and utterly foreign. Next to him was Chloe, his wife, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone more important to impress. And across from them were the Sterlings, Richard with his slicked back hair and patronizing posture, and Beatrice, whose sharp, nasal laughter cut through the soft, classical music. I leaned closer to the partition, my senses heightened by the adrenaline of betrayal. The waiter poured a vintage Cabernet. Richard Sterling raised his glass, his voice carrying easily over the ambient chatter. He toasted to Julian's recent promotion at the firm, a firm that only existed because of my initial capital. Richard chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension, asking Julian how his quaint father was spending his Father's Day. Julian smiled, but it was a weak, cowardly smile. He took a sip of his wine before replying that his father was probably at home, eating a cheap steak, perfectly content in his simple blue-collar world. Chloe laughed, a high-pitched mocking sound, and added that it was a blessing I couldn't make it. She remarked that the last time she saw me, I had dirt under my fingernails, and she simply couldn't imagine trying to introduce someone so unrefined to their circle of friends. Beatrice chimed in, waving her jeweled hand, saying that some people are simply born for the dirt, and no amount of money can buy class. The real blow, however, came from my own flesh and blood. Julian didn't defend me. Instead, he nodded in agreement. He told them he had to invent a fake emergency at the office just to escape my invitation, admitting he was embarrassed by my lack of sophistication. He said he couldn't bear the thought of me sitting at a table like this, ruining their polished image. Sitting in the shadows, I felt the last lingering warmth of my paternal patience evaporate. I looked at my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, now eagerly selling his father's dignity for a seat at a table he didn't even realize I owned. They laughed, clinked their glasses, and feasted on my dime, completely unaware that the foundation beneath their feet was already beginning to crumble. I did not drive home in a fury. I drove home in a state of absolute mathematical precision. The pain of hearing my own son describe me as an unrefined simpleton to those parasitic social climbers did not break me. It recalibrated me. When a high-rise building begins to lean, an engineer does not weep. He immediately looks for the foundational failure. I walked into my quiet study, leaving the cold steaks in the kitchen, and sat behind my heavy mahogany desk. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a rhythmic, unforgiving cadence, marking the exact moments my paternal leniency died. My son believed I was just a retired old man playing with dirt. He had forgotten that before I retired, I spent 40 years calculating tolerances and dissecting complex structural blueprints. Tonight, I would dissect him. I unlocked the heavy iron safe concealed behind the portrait of my late grandfather. Inside lay the physical deeds to my ancestral estate, alongside decades of meticulously kept financial ledgers. I booted up my secure laptop and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Marcus, a senior vice president at the state's central bank who owed his entire career to my early investments. The second was to a highly discreet forensic accountant who had kept my corporate empire bulletproof for 30 years. I did not care that it was past midnight. In my world, loyalty is the ultimate currency, and I had plenty of it stored away. I instructed them to pull every transaction, every corporate filing, and every line of credit associated with the Sterling family and my own private family trust. For the next 4 hours, my study became a war room. As the digital files began pouring into my encrypted inbox, I analyzed them with the same cold, critical eye I used to inspect cracked concrete foundations. The Sterling's glittering empire was nothing but a hollow cardboard cutout. Their high-end luxury retail business, which they flaunted like a badge of nobility, was suffocating under a mountain of toxic debt. They were mere weeks away from public bankruptcy, desperately scrambling for a lifeline. But then, my eyes locked onto a recent filing from my own private family trust, the trust I had established for Julian, which was strictly tied to my multi-million-dollar ancestral estate. My breath caught in my throat as I zoomed in on a notarized loan agreement dated just 3 weeks ago. There, at the bottom of the document, was my signature. It looked remarkably genuine to the untrained eye, but I knew my own handwriting like the back of my hand. The angle of the swoop on the letter A, the unnatural pressure of the ink on the digital scan. It was a forgery, a calculated, desperate imitation. Julian had used his access as a secondary trustee to forge my signature, collateralizing my historic ancestral estate to secure a massive $10 million bailout loan for the Sterling's failing business. My own son had put my family's legacy on the chopping block to buy the favor of people who despised us. The sheer audacity of the betrayal settled deep into my bones, replacing my grief with a hardened, unbreakable resolve. Julian had not just lied about a Father's Day dinner. He had conspired with parasites to steal the very ground I stood on. They thought I was a fragile old man waiting to be swept away. They had no idea that by trying to pull down my foundation, they had triggered a landslide that would bury them all. I closed the ledger, took a slow, deep breath, and began drafting the legal paperwork that would dismantle my son's gilded cage piece by piece. There is a terrifying clarity that comes when you realize your own child views your life's work not as a legacy to protect, but as a carcass to be picked clean by wolves in silk. As the forensic documents illuminated my face in the dark study, I did not feel anger. I felt a profound, freezing disappointment. The financial spreadsheets in front of me revealed the ugly, desperate truth about the Sterling family. They were not high society royalty. They were financial ghosts, drowning in a massive sea of red ink, hiding behind a crumbling facade of designer labels and rented luxury. Their retail empire was a hollow shell, suffocating under millions of dollars of unpaid loans and high-interest credit lines. They were desperate, and they had found their savior in my son, Julian. They had groomed him, fed his fragile ego, and convinced him that my ancestral estate was his birthright to dispose of as he pleased. To them, my decades of sacrifice were just a convenient piggy bank, an easy cash grab to keep their sinking ship afloat for another few months. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking down at my hands. These worn hands had laid the physical foundations of this city. I remembered the freezing winter mornings on construction sites, the taste of rust and concrete dust in the back of my throat, and the bone-deep ache of working 18-hour days to ensure my son would never know the sting of poverty. I had poured my sweat, my blood, and my youth into every brick of my historic estate. It was a monument to genuine labor, designed to stand for generations. Yet Julian and his in-laws wanted to tear it down to pay for country club memberships, lease luxury vehicles, and finance their endless, empty champagne toasts. The sheer superficiality of their greed disgusted me. They possessed fragile, paper-thin egos that required constant validation from strangers, whereas I had always found my worth in the quiet strength of things that endure, the solid iron, the deep roots, and the silent truth of a job well done. They believed their polished manners and expensive silk suits made them naturally superior. But beneath the fabric, they were nothing but starving parasites. My strategic mind, trained to identify structural failure before a collapse, immediately began calculating the counterstrike. I could have called the authorities right then. I could have frozen the trust accounts with a single phone call right then and watched them panic by morning. But a quick defeat is too merciful for a betrayal of this magnitude. When a building is structurally compromised, you do not just patch the crack. You must dismantle the faulty beams systematically so they do not crush the innocent when they fall. I decided to let them have their illusion of victory. I would let Julian believe his forgery had gone unnoticed. I would let the Sterlings celebrate their genius for one more day, toast to their impending rescue, and spend money they did not actually have yet. Let them feel the warmth of their stolen triumph, because tomorrow morning, the foundation they stole will turn to dust beneath their expensive feet. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing like a cold hammer strike in the silent room. Let them sleep well tonight, for tomorrow, the storm of their own making will arrive, and I will not be there to save them. There is no room for hesitation when you're pouring the concrete of a final judgment. I did not sleep after discovering my son's forgery, nor did I allow myself the useless luxury of grief. Instead, I sat in the dim morning light of my study, watching the clock tick toward 5 o'clock, waiting for the precise moment to execute a structural demolition of Julian's carefully constructed lies. When you find a column that has rotted to its core, you do not try to patch it. You pull it down before the entire roof collapses on your head. My primary estate attorney, Thomas, a man who has guarded my assets for 3 decades, met me at my office just as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. He did not ask why I had called him at such an ungodly hour. He simply looked at the forged loan agreement on my desk, then looked into my eyes, and he knew that the boy we both helped raise had crossed a line from which there was no return. Thomas laid out the paperwork with a clinical, quiet efficiency that matched my own resolve. We did not speak of family ties. We spoke of assets, trusts, and legal boundaries. With a few strokes of my heavy fountain pen, I began the systematic deconstruction of my son's artificial empire. First, I signed the absolute revocation of Julian's power of attorney, stripping him of any authority to act on my behalf or touch a single dime of my legacy. The scratching of the metal nib against the thick parchment felt like the physical severing of an umbilical cord, sharp and permanent. Next, we drafted the immediate freeze on all trust funds allocated to him. The luxury credit cards, the monthly stipends, the investment accounts that funded his designer suits. All of it was instantly locked. He had wanted to play the high society savior for his bankrupt in-laws using my sweat, so I decided to let him see how far his new family's respect would carry him when he was completely penniless. But the final blow was the townhouse. The elegant, 3-story luxury property in the historic district where Julian and Chloe lived was not their own, though they flaunted it as if it were. It was owned entirely by my private real estate trust. I pulled the deed from the folder, sliding it toward Thomas. I instructed him to draft an immediate eviction notice, giving them exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Thomas paused for a brief second, his pen hovering, asking if I was absolutely certain about making this so sudden. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that when a tenant attempts to burn down the house, you do not let them stay for the weekend. To ensure there was no escape or quiet cover-up, I arranged for these papers to be delivered in public. The Sterlings were hosting a celebratory luncheon at noon today to announce their business's salvation. My son Julian was scheduled to stand beside them, basking in their hollow praise. I told Thomas to have a process server walk straight into that dining room, in front of the cameras and their wealthy associates, and hand Julian the legal papers. Let them receive the news of their ruin at the peak of their arrogance. The legal trap was now securely and completely locked. There is a cold, heavy finality in knowing that the boy you spent a lifetime building up has chosen to tear you down for a seat at a table of fools. I did not feel a single tremor of hesitation as I pushed open the double doors of the grand private dining suite at the Obsidian. The room smelled of expensive truffles, vintage red wine, and the suffocating perfume of unearned luxury. At the center of the long linen-draped table sat Julian, flanked by Chloe and her parents, Richard and Beatrice Sterling. They were raising their crystal flutes in a final joyous toast to their supposed financial salvation, their faces flushed with the cheap arrogance of thieves who believed they had gotten away with the perfect heist. The moment my boots clicked against the polished marble floor, the laughter died. Julian froze, his glass hovering mid-air, the color rapidly draining from his cheeks as his eyes locked onto mine. Chloe was the first to break the silence, her face twisting into a sneer of utter disgust as she set her glass down with a sharp clink. She asked me what on earth I was doing there, demanding to know how a simple, unrefined old man like me had even managed to bypass the security of a five-star establishment. Beatrice chimed in, waving her hand as if trying to clear the air of a foul odor, loudly declaring that this was a private, high society celebration and that uninvited, dusty nuisances belonged in the alleyways, not here. Richard Sterling leaned back, a patronizing, smug smile spreading across his face as he told me to run along back to my little blue-collar world before they had the staff throw me out into the street. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, my posture straight and my expression as unyielding as a reinforced concrete pillar. Just as Richard reached for the service bell to summon security, the heavy mahogany doors swung open again. But it was not the security team. It was the restaurant's general manager, a man who had managed my high-end properties for a decade. He did not look at the Sterlings. Instead, he walked directly to my side, stopped, and bowed his head in deep, absolute respect. He addressed me as Mr. Arthur, asking if everything was to my satisfaction and informing me that the entire building was, as always, at my complete disposal. The silence that fell over the room was sudden and absolute. Chloe's mouth hung open, her sneer freezing into a mask of pure confusion. Richard's hand remained suspended over the service bell, his smug smile vanishing as he looked between me and the bowing manager. I stepped forward, pulling a thick leather folder from under my arm, and placed it directly in the center of their pristine white tablecloth, knocking over a half-empty glass of Cabernet. The dark red liquid pooled across the fabric, looking remarkably like a fresh wound. I opened the folder and laid down the first document, the freeze on Julian's trust accounts. I watched my son's hands begin to tremble as he realized his luxury credit cards and endless cash flow had ceased to exist. Next, I laid down the eviction notice for their townhouse, giving them 48 hours to vacate my property. Finally, I placed the heavy, stamped formal police report for multi-million-dollar forgery and grand larceny directly in front of Richard Sterling. A choked, nervous laugh escaped Beatrice's throat, a desperate attempt to pretend this was all a misunderstanding, but the sound died instantly as she looked at the official state prosecutor's seal. I looked my son in the eye, my voice quiet, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy, and told him that his feast was officially over. A crack in a concrete pillar does not heal itself when you plead with it, and yet my son looked at me as if tears could somehow undo the massive weight of his forgery. The silence in the private dining suite of the Obsidian was heavy, broken only by the sharp, ragged sound of Julian's breathing. The arrogance that had painted his face only moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, hollow terror. He reached across the table, his hand trembling so violently he knocked over his water glass, the liquid spreading to join the dark red wine stain on the white linen. He gasped, begging me to listen, calling me Dad for the first time in months. He pleaded that the Sterlings had pressured him, that he only did it to secure his future. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the hand trying to grasp my sleeve. I felt no anger, only a profound, quiet sorrow for the boy I had raised, who had grown up to become a stranger. Across the table, the grand facade of the Sterling family was disintegrating in real time. Richard Sterling's face had turned an ash-gray color, his fingers twitching near the forged documents, realizing his hollow retail empire was finally dead. Beatrice sat frozen, her mouth open in a silent gasp, her heavily jeweled hands suddenly looking like cheap, meaningless trinkets. Chloe looked at Julian, not with sympathy, but with a cold, calculating disgust, realizing her husband was no longer her golden ticket to luxury. The parasites were already preparing to abandon the sinking ship. Julian fell to his knees, his voice cracking as he asked how I could do this to my own flesh and blood on Father's Day. I looked down at him, my heart breaking, but my resolve remaining as unyielding as the iron foundations of my factories. I told him gently that I did not do this to him. He did this to himself the moment he decided that my lifetime of hard work, my sweat, and our family name were things he could sell to buy the temporary approval of people who despised us. I looked him straight in the eyes and delivered the final, hardest lesson a father could ever give. I told him that a man's worth is not measured by the height of his seat at a fancy table, nor by the designer label on his suit. It is measured by his integrity, his willingness to stand by his word, and the strength of the foundation he builds for himself. He had chosen to build his life on the shifting sands of vanity, and now the structure was collapsing. The trust fund was gone, the townhouse was gone, and his connection to my name was severed. He would have to learn to build his own foundation from the very dirt he had so deeply despised. I turned away from his weeping, ignoring the desperate call of my name, and walked out of the dining room. Stepping through the heavy doors into the cool, clean night air, the suffocating warmth of their greed melted away. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the pavement glistening under the streetlights, and the quiet chirp of night birds filled the air. For 45 years, I built structures designed to withstand the heaviest storms. Tonight, I saved the only legacy that truly mattered, my own dignity, and the quiet peace of an honest life.